They told her the Americans would strip her of dignity. That captivity meant violation and shame. That surrender was only the beginning of suffering. But when Private Jim Sullivan's hands suddenly closed around the collar of Elena Hartman's torn Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform on that cold October morning in 1945, her scream cut through the Louisiana air like broken glass. "Please don't hurt me." The words ripped from her throat before she could stop them, before she could remember the training about showing no weakness, before she could recall the propaganda about American brutality that had been drilled into her head for the past 6 years. The young soldier released her immediately. His hands flew up, palms out, fingers spread wide in a gesture of surrender that made no sense. He was the victor. She was the prisoner. Yet he looked at her with something that resembled confusion, maybe even hurt. "Ma'am," he said, his southern accent thick and slow like honey poured from a jar. "I'm just trying to help. That tear is going to get worse in the cold." Elena stood frozen in the processing yard of Camp Ruston, Louisiana, her body still trembling from the adrenaline of fear, her mind struggling to reconcile what she had expected with what was actually happening. The soldier was young, maybe 25, with red hair that caught fire in the morning sun and freckles scattered across sunburned skin like stars across a summer sky. His eyes were kind, impossibly dangerously kind. Around them, the other 42 German women stood in a tight cluster, their faces pale with exhaustion and terror, their bodies thin beneath their torn and dirty uniforms. They had been traveling for 3 days across America by train, watching the landscape transform from the industrial ruins of the eastern seaboard to the impossible green expansiveness of the South. Everything here looked alien. The sky was too blue. The sun was too bright. The air smelled of pine and something sweet that Elena could not identify, something that had no place in the world she had known for the past 2 years. In Berlin, October meant frost and gray skies and the acrid smell of burning rubble. Here the heat pressed down like a warm hand on her shoulders. The humidity made her skin feel sticky. The whitewashed barracks stretched across flat land bordered by tall trees draped in hanging moss that looked like something from a fairy tale, something unreal and vaguely threatening. The soldier was still standing there, his hands still raised, waiting for her to say something, to do something, to stop looking at him like he was about to strike her. "I'm Private Walker," he said, dropping the formal military tone and speaking to her like she was a person, not a prisoner. "Tommy Walker, from Georgia. I'm here to help you ladies get processed and settled. Nobody's going to hurt you. You got my word on that." Elena wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him. But believing meant trusting, and trusting the enemy was the fastest way to get yourself killed. That much she knew. That much the Reich had taught her well. She nodded once, a tiny movement of her head, and Private Walker smiled. It was a brief, genuine expression that transformed his face from merely kind to something approaching beautiful in its openness. "All right then," he said, "let's get you ladies inside before you melt in this heat." This was not the cruelty she had been promised. This was something far more dangerous. This was kindness, and kindness, she would soon learn, was harder to survive than hate. The 43 women moved as one organism, a collective body of fear and exhaustion and desperate hope they were too afraid to acknowledge. They filed into the processing building, a long wooden structure, painted the same impossible white as the barracks, with ceiling fans turning slowly overhead and windows that actually opened to let in fresh air. Inside, other American soldiers waited, but they were nothing like what Elena had imagined. They were not brutal. They were not cruel. They were ordinary. Young men in clean uniforms, some barely old enough to shave, others showing the weathered faces of farm boys who had seen too much war. They held clipboards. They called out names. They pointed toward different areas of the building with gestures that were almost apologetic. The smell hit Elena first. Not death, not the acrid smoke of burning cities that had filled her nostrils for the past 2 years. Instead, it was food, real food, bread baking somewhere nearby, coffee rich and bitter, meat cooking on grills that must have been behind the building, out of sight, but close enough that the scent drifted through the open windows and made her stomach clench so violently she had to press one hand against her abdomen. She had not eaten a real meal in months. On the prison ships crossing the Atlantic, they had been given thin soup and hard bread. Before that, in the processing camps in Europe, there had been even less. Before that, in Berlin during the final days of the Reich, there had been nothing but scraps and rumors, and the constant gnawing hunger that made you forget what it felt like to be full. Now the smell of actual cooking meat made her mouth water, and her stomach cramp, and her eyes blur with tears that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with a longing so intense it felt like violence. The sounds were different too. American voices, casual and loud without the clipped precision of German military commands. Someone was laughing, actually laughing. A soldier standing near a jeep talking to another man, his head thrown back in genuine amusement. Elena had not heard laughter like that in so long, she had almost forgotten what it sounded like. In Berlin, in the bunkers, in the chaotic final days of the Reich, there had been only screaming or sobbing or silence. Her name was called Elena Hartmann, a female voice American accented but clear enough that she understood. She stepped forward on legs that felt like water, her arms still wrapped around herself to hold the torn uniform, closed, hyper-aware of how exposed she felt, with the fabric hanging open at her shoulder. The woman who called her name was older, maybe 40, with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun and kind eyes behind round spectacles. She wore an American military uniform with the insignia of the medical corps, and when she smiled at Elena, the expression reached all the way to those eyes. "Good afternoon," the woman said. "I'm Captain Morrison. I need to do a quick health check. It won't take long and you can keep your undergarments on. I just need to check for lice. Look at any injuries and make sure you're not carrying any contagious diseases." "Okay," Elena nodded. She did not trust her voice yet. Her throat felt tight, closed off by emotions she could not name. The examination room was small and clean, with a single bed covered in white sheets and a table holding medical instruments that gleamed under the electric lights. Electric lights, not candles, not oil lamps. Actual electric lights that did not flicker or dim or threaten to go out at any moment. Captain Morrison gestured to a chair, and Elena sat down slowly, carefully, like an old woman with brittle bones. She removed her torn uniform jacket, acutely aware of how thin she had become. Her ribs were visible through her undershirt. Her collarbones jutted out sharply. Her arms looked like sticks, all bone and tendon, with barely any muscle left. She looked like the survivors she had seen in newsreels from the camps. The thought made her stomach turn. "You're malnourished," Captain Morrison said quietly. Her touch gentle as she examined Elena's scalp, checked her eyes and throat, listened to her heartbeat with a stethoscope that felt cold against her skin, even through the thin fabric of her undershirt. "But you're going to be okay. We're going to get some weight back on you." It was the kindness in her voice that broke something inside Elena. She had expected coldness, clinical detachment at best, cruelty at worst. Instead, this American doctor was treating her like a human being, like someone who mattered, like someone who deserved care. When the examination was finished, Captain Morrison handed Elena a bundle of clothes, not a uniform, simple civilian clothes. A pale blue cotton dress with small white flowers printed on the fabric, clean undergarments, thick socks, and a wool cardigan soft and expertly knitted in a shade of cream that reminded Elena of her grandmother's kitchen. "Your old uniform is pretty worn out," the doctor said. "You can keep it if you want for sentimental reasons, but you'll be more comfortable in these. They're donated from local churches." The cardigan was knitted by a volunteer group in town. It gets cold here at night, even in October. Elena took the clothes with hands that would not stop shaking. The fabric was soft against her rough palms. Clean. When she held the cardigan to her face, it smelled like lavender soap, like spring mornings in a world that no longer existed, like everything she had lost and everything she might possibly impossibly find again. "Thank you," she whispered. The words came out broken, barely audible. "You're welcome," Captain Morrison said, and her smile was warm enough to hurt. "There's a shower facility next door. Hot water, soap, shampoo. Take your time. When you're done, there's food in the mess hall. I know you're probably starving. Just take it slow, okay? Your stomach's going to need time to adjust to regular meals again." The shower facility was tiled and white with individual stalls and curtains for privacy. Elena stood outside one of the stalls for a long moment, just staring at it, not quite believing it was real. Then she stepped inside, pulled the curtain closed, and turned on the water. Hot water poured from the shower head. Actually hot, Not lukewarm, not cold. Hot enough to steam in the cool air, then hot enough to turn her skin pink, hot enough to make her gasp with something that felt dangerously close to pleasure. She stood under the spray and could not stop crying. The tears came in great heaving sobs that shook her whole body. She pressed her hands over her mouth to muffle the sounds, not wanting anyone to hear, not wanting to appear weak. But the tears kept coming pouring out of her like the water pouring from the shower head, washing away months of dirt and fear and accumulated grief. The soap actually lathered. It was not the gritty chemical smelling blocks they had been given on the prison ships, the kind that left your skin feeling raw and tight. This soap was smooth and creamy, and it smelled like flowers. Elena washed her hair 3 times, watching the dirt and oil swirl down the drain, scrubbing her scalp until it tingled, working the lather through hair that had not been properly cleaned in longer than she could remember. She washed her body with the same desperate thoroughness, scrubbing her skin until it was pink and raw, trying to wash away not just the physical dirt, but something deeper, something that had settled into her bones during the long months of war and defeat and captivity. When she finally turned off the water and wrapped herself in the clean towel that had been left on a bench outside the stall, she caught sight of herself in the mirror and barely recognized the face looking back. Her hair, clean and wet, hung in dark waves around her face. Her skin, scrubbed of months of grime, was pale but no longer gray. Her eyes, blue and large, and her thin face looked younger than they had in years. She looked almost human again, almost like the girl she had been before the war swallowed her whole. She dressed slowly in the donated clothes, savoring the feel of clean fabric against clean skin. The cotton dress was slightly too large, hanging loose on her 20 pounds lighter frame, but it was the most comfortable thing she had worn in 2 years. The cardigan was warm and soft, the kind of thing her grandmother might have made, the kind of thing that spoke of care and attention, and someone taking the time to create something beautiful just for the sake of beauty. She pulled it tight around herself, breathing in the lavender scent, and felt something dangerous stir in her chest. Hope. She tried to push it down. Hope was dangerous. Hope would make this harder. Hope meant caring about what happened next, and caring was the fastest way to get hurt. But it bloomed anyway, fragile and persistent, like those yellow flowers she had seen growing outside the administrative building. In Germany, nothing grew anymore except rubble and ash. But here, flowers grew. Here, strangers knitted cardigans for enemy prisoners. Here, the impossible seemed to be the ordinary. The mess hall was large and bright, with long tables and benches and windows that let in the afternoon sun. The smell of food was overwhelming now, so intense it made Elena dizzy. She joined the other women in line, each of them clutching their new clothes, hair still damp from showers, moving like people in a trance. At the serving counter, American soldiers in white aprons ladled food onto metal trays. Real food. Elena stared at what was being placed on her tray, not quite believing what she was seeing. Mashed potatoes with butter melting into them, creating golden pools in the white mass. Green beans that were actually green, not the gray-brown color of canned vegetables. A thick slice of meatloaf still steaming the top, crusted with the glaze that smelled of tomatoes and brown sugar. A roll soft and white with more butter on the side. A cup of coffee with real cream and real sugar available to add. And for dessert, a slice of apple pie. Apple pie. Elena carried her tray to a table with hands that shook so badly she was afraid she would drop it. She sat down and just stared at the food. Around her, other women were doing the same. Some were crying, some were laughing in disbelief. Some were eating so fast they were making themselves sick, unable to control the desperate hunger that drove them to consume everything as quickly as possible before it could be taken away. Elena forced herself to eat slowly the way Captain Morrison had instructed. The first bite of meatloaf was so rich it made her dizzy. The flavor exploded on her tongue, savory and sweet and complex in a way she had forgotten food could be. The potatoes were creamy and warm, the butter coating her mouth with a richness that felt almost obscene. The green beans were fresh. Not from a can. Actually fresh. They crunched between her teeth with a satisfying texture that brought tears to her eyes. But it was the apple pie that undid her completely. She took one bite and the sweetness exploded on her tongue like a bomb. Cinnamon and sugar and tender apple filling, combining with the flaky, buttery crust in a way that was so perfect, so impossibly perfect, that she could not contain the sob that rose in her throat. In Berlin, her mother was probably eating potato peel soup. if she was eating at all. Her father, if he was still alive, was somewhere in the Soviet occupation zone, starving like the rest of Germany. Her younger brother Karl had died on the Eastern Front 2 years ago, his body left in some unmarked grave in the snow. And here she was, a prisoner of war, eating apple pie. The guilt crashed over her like a wave so intense it felt like drowning. The sweetness in her mouth turned bitter. The food that had seemed like a gift now felt like a betrayal. She was alive and fed and warm while her people died, while her family starved, while Germany burned in the ruins of its own making. She set down her fork and pressed her hands against her face, trying to hold back the sobs that wanted to tear out of her chest. A hand touched her shoulder gently, and she flinched before she could stop herself. "It's okay to cry, ma'am." The voice was male familiar. Private Walker, the red-haired soldier from the processing yard. He was standing beside her table holding out a pressed white handkerchief with initials embroidered in one corner. "JSS, I reckon you got a lot to cry about." He continued his slow Georgia drawl, somehow soothing in its unhurried cadence. "But you're safe here. I know that probably don't mean much right now, but it's the truth. You're safe, you're fed, and nobody's gonna hurt you. I give you my word on that." Elena took the handkerchief with shaking hands. The fabric was clean and soft, the embroidery careful and precise. Someone had taken the time to stitch those initials. Someone had cared enough to make this small, ordinary object beautiful. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely audible. "I am sorry, I do not mean to be weak." "Ain't weakness, ma'am," Private Walker said, and his voice was so gentle it made her want to cry harder. "It's being human. You finish your meal. Take your time. When you're ready, we'll get you settled in your barracks." He walked away, leaving her with the handkerchief and the half-eaten apple pie and the crushing weight of being treated with kindness by the enemy. Elena looked down at the embroidered initials. JSS, James Sullivan. Tommy Walker was James Sullivan. She tried out the name in her mind, testing it, trying to reconcile this kind-voiced farm boy with everything she had been taught about Americans. They were supposed to be brutal, uncivilized, cruel to prisoners. That was what the propaganda had said. That was what she had believed. But the propaganda had been wrong about so many things. Around her, the other women were having similar experiences. Clara, the 19-year-old from Hamburg, was crying over her meatloaf. Greta Wolf, the 35-year-old former radio operator from Frankfurt, was staring at her apple pie like it was a religious artifact. An older woman, whose name Elena did not yet know, was laughing and crying at the same time, unable to process the contradiction between what she had expected and what she was experiencing. They were all breaking. All of them. The kindness was breaking them in ways that cruelty never could have. Elena picked up her fork and took another bite of apple pie. The sweetness was still there, still overwhelming, but she forced herself to swallow it, to accept it, to let herself have this one moment of something that resembled comfort, even if it came wrapped in guilt and confusion, and the terrifying possibility that everything she had believed might have been a lie. The barracks were simple but clean. Rows of bunk beds with thin mattresses covered in white sheets and wool blankets. Each bed had a small footlocker for personal belongings. There were windows that actually opened, letting in fresh air that smelled of pine and warm earth. The bathroom facilities were at the end of the building, and they had running water and flush toilets in sinks with actual soap. Elena was assigned a lower bunk near one of the windows. She sat on the mattress, testing its firmness, and felt the absurdity of the situation wash over her in waves. This was better than her bedroom in Berlin had been during the final years of the war. This prison was more comfortable than her life as a free woman had been. The thought should have made her angry, should have made her feel something sharp and righteous. Instead, she just felt tired. Bone-deep, soul-crushing, tired. As night fell, the women gathered in small groups, whispering in German, trying to make sense of what had happened to them. Some were suspicious, convinced this was a trick, that the real cruelty would come later. Others were simply grateful to be alive, to be clean and fed, unable to think beyond the immediate relief of physical comfort. A few, like Elena, were caught in a liminal space between relief and guilt, unable to reconcile the propaganda they had been taught with the reality they were experiencing. Greta Wolf sat down on the bunk next to Elena's. She was a sturdy woman with graying hair, pulled back in a practical bun, and tired eyes that had seen too much. So Greta said quietly, speaking German in a low voice that would not carry to the American guards stationed at the doors, "This is what the enemy looks like. Hot showers and apple pie. Elena nodded slowly. I do not understand it. Neither do I, Greta said. But I'll tell you what I think. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. I think they're showing us what we could have had if we had chosen differently. I think they're showing us what the world looks like when you don't destroy it. Elena looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the pain in the older woman's eyes. The understanding, the dawning realization that they had been on the wrong side of history. They were not just prisoners here. They were witnesses, witnesses to their own nation's failure, to the lie they had been sold, to the reality they had refused to see until it was too late. That night, lying in her clean bunk under a warm blanket, Elena stared at the ceiling and whispered a prayer she had not said since she was a child. Not a prayer for deliverance or forgiveness, just a prayer of gratitude for being alive, for being clean, for being impossibly safe. But gratitude, she was learning, was its own kind of punishment. Because how do you give thanks for comfort when your people are dying? How do you accept kindness from the enemy without feeling like a traitor? How do you reconcile the person you thought you were with the person you are becoming? These questions would haunt her in the weeks to come. They would drive her to the edge of starvation as she tried to balance the scales between her suffering and her mother's. They would force her to confront everything she had believed about herself, about her country, about the meaning of loyalty and love and survival. But for now, on this first night in Camp Ruston, Louisiana, Elena Hartman simply closed her eyes and tried to sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, new opportunities to be broken by kindness. But tonight she was warm. She was clean. She was fed. And that for now would have to be enough. Acts 2. Daily rhythms. The first weeks at Camp Ruston followed a rhythm that was both foreign and strangely comforting. The women woke at 7 to the sound of a bell. Not a harsh military alarm, but a simple, almost gentle clanging that echoed across the compound like a church calling the faithful to morning mass. They dressed in their donated civilian clothes, made their beds with military precision because some habits were impossible to break, and walked to the mess hall for breakfast. Breakfast was always the same. Eggs scrambled or fried depending on the day, toast with real butter and jam, coffee that smelled like heaven and tasted better than anything Elena remembered from before the war. Sometimes there was bacon crispy and salty and so rich it made her mouth water. Sometimes sausage, always more food than they could possibly eat. Elena watched as the other women's faces began to change. The hollow cheeks filled out. The gray pallor gave way to healthier color. Shoulders that had been hunched with exhaustion slowly straightened. They were gaining weight, regaining their strength, transforming from skeletal survivors into something that resembled normal women again. After breakfast, they were assigned to work details. Nothing harsh or punishing, just simple labor that kept them occupied and gave structure to their days. Some women worked in the camp laundry washing and folding linens in industrial machines that did most of the heavy work. Others helped in the kitchen, peeling vegetables and cleaning dishes under the supervision of American cooks who treated them more like students than prisoners. A few, including Elena, were assigned to the administrative office. Her education and language skills made her useful for filing paperwork and eventually translating documents. It was here in the quiet office with its typewriters and filing cabinets and maps on the walls that she found herself working alongside Private Jim Sullivan. He had asked to be assigned as one of the liaisons between the American staff and the German prisoners. Elena suspected it was because of what had happened that first day, the way she had screamed when he touched her uniform, the fear in her eyes that had seemed to hurt him somehow. Now he appeared every morning with a smile and a cheerful greeting, determined to teach her English words and phrases that went beyond basic commands. "Good morning, Miss Hartman," he would say, enunciating each word carefully. "How are you feeling today?" At first, Elena could only manage simple responses. "Good, thank you." But as the days passed, her vocabulary expanded. Jim was patient, never mocking her mistakes, always encouraging her attempts to communicate. "No, ma'am," he said one morning when she tried to describe the weather. "It's raining cats and dogs, not raining animals like pets." He grinned at her confusion, his freckled face lighting up with genuine amusement. "It's just an expression," he explained. "Means it's raining real hard. Don't ask me why we say it that way." English is a strange language. Elena found herself smiling despite herself. "Your language is very confusing." "You're doing great, though," he said. "Better than I do trying to learn German, I reckon." These small conversations became the highlight of Elena's days. Jim talked about his family's farm in Georgia, about his mother, who baked the best peach cobbler in 3 counties, about his sister Emma, who wanted to be a teacher, about the red clay soil and the summer heat, and the way lightning bugs filled the fields at dusk. He made America sound real. Not the propaganda version she had been taught, not the enemy nation of her imagination, but a place where ordinary people lived ordinary lives, where mothers baked cobbler and sisters dreamed of teaching and lightning bugs danced in the twilight. It was disorienting, dangerous. The more human Jim became, the harder it was to maintain the wall between enemy and person, between them and us. The work itself was easy, almost pointless, but Elena understood its real purpose. It was not about productivity. It was about giving them structure, purpose, a reason to get out of bed each morning. It was about reminding them they were still human beings capable of contributing something, however small. In the afternoons, there was free time. The women could read books from the camp library, mostly English novels, though there were a few German texts. They could write letters home, though responses were sporadic and heavily censored. They could simply sit in the shade and talk, processing their experiences, trying to understand what was happening to them. Some played cards, others sewed or knitted, creating small things from donated materials. A few brave souls even tried to learn American songs from the radio that played constantly in the recreation hall. The music was strange syncopated rhythms and sliding notes that sounded nothing like the German marches and folk songs Elena had grown up with. Once a week, they were allowed to shop at the camp canteen, a small store where they could use the wages earned from their work assignments to buy small luxuries. The wages were tiny, almost symbolic, $2 a week. But the act of choosing, of purchasing, of having some small measure of control over their lives was psychologically vital. Elena bought a notebook and a pen with her first week's wages. She began keeping a diary, writing in German, recording not just the events of each day, but the confusion of emotions that came with them. She wrote about the guilt, the gratitude, the cognitive dissonance of being treated well by the people she had been taught to hate. She wrote about Jim Sullivan and his patient English lessons, about Greta Wolf and her quiet wisdom, about the way apple pie tasted like both comfort and betrayal. She wrote about her mother in Berlin, wondering if her letters were getting through, if Anna was still alive, if the basement apartment had survived another winter. The writing helped. Not much, but enough to keep her sane. The letter. 6 weeks after arriving at Camp Ruston, Elena received her first letter from home. It arrived on a cold November morning, the Louisiana air finally cooling into something that resembled the autumn she remembered from Germany. The mail call was conducted in the mess hall after breakfast, an American officer reading out names in heavily accented German, handing out thin envelopes that had traveled across an ocean and through multiple censorship checkpoints. When Elena heard her name, her heart stopped. The envelope was so thin, it was almost transparent. The paper was the cheap wartime stuff, rough and gray. The handwriting was her mother's, but it looked shaky, uncertain. Nothing like the confident script Elena remembered. She took the envelope to her bunk and sat down, just holding it for a long moment. Part of her did not want to open it, did not want to know what horrors it might contain. As long as the letter remained sealed, her mother was alive. Her family was surviving. The moment she read it, reality would intrude. But she could not leave it unopened forever. She slid her finger under the flap and carefully extracted the single sheet of paper inside. "My dearest Elena." It began, and just those 3 words were enough to make her vision blur with tears. "I do not know if this letter will reach you. I do not even know if you are alive. We have heard nothing since you were captured. The city is ruins. We live in the basement with 3 other families. There is no heat, no electricity most days. We eat what we can find. Yesterday, your Aunt Gertrude traded her wedding ring for half a loaf of bread. Your father is still missing. We pray he is alive somewhere in the Soviet zone, but we fear the worst. Karl's grave is somewhere on the Eastern Front. We will never find it. We will never be able to bring him home. If you are receiving this, if you are safe, I thank God. Do not worry about us. We will survive. We always do. Know that I love you. Know that I am proud of you. Come home to us when you can. Your loving mother, Anna." Elena read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully, precisely, and tucked it under her pillow, where she could feel it when she lay down at night. That evening, she could not eat her dinner. The meatloaf and mashed potatoes sat untouched on her tray, while around her other women ate and talked and laughed at some joke someone had made. The normalcy of it felt obscene. How could they laugh when Germany was starving? How could she eat when her mother was trading family heirlooms for bread? She pushed the tray away and left the mess hall, walking out into the cool November evening, wrapping her arms around herself against the chill. She was not the only one struggling. All around the camp, women were receiving similar letters, stories of devastation, starvation, desperation. The contrast between their lives here and the reality of Germany was becoming impossible to ignore. Some women stopped eating altogether, trying to somehow balance the scales between their comfort and their family's suffering. Others ate mechanically without pleasure, treating meals as a necessary function rather than a gift. Elena fell somewhere in between. She forced herself to eat enough to stay functional, but she took no joy in it. The food that had once seemed like a miracle now tasted like ashes in her mouth. Jim noticed. Of course he noticed. He seemed to notice everything. "Miss Hartman," he said one afternoon when she had pushed her lunch tray away after eating only a few bites. "You need to eat. You're getting thin again." Elena looked up at him, this kind-faced farm boy who could never understand what she was feeling. "My mother is hungry," she said quietly. "I got letter. She has no food. How can I eat when she is starving?" Jim was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, his elbows on the table, his face serious. "Ma'am, I understand. I do. But you starving yourself ain't going to feed your mama. It's just going to make two people hungry instead of one." He leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "You need to stay strong. So when this war is finally over, when you can go home, you'll be healthy enough to help her. You see?" Elena looked at him, really looked at him, and felt something shift inside her chest. He was right. She knew he was right. But knowing something and accepting it were two different things. "It is hard," she whispered, "to be treated so well by the enemy. Harder than being treated badly would be." Jim nodded slowly. "I reckon that's true. Hate's easier than kindness. Kindness makes you think, makes you question." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But ma'am, we ain't your enemy. We never were. We were fighting a war against your leaders, not against you. You were just caught in the middle, same as a lot of folks." His words stayed with Elena long after he left. "We were fighting your leaders, not you." It was such a simple idea, but it turned everything she had believed upside down. The propaganda had always told them that the Allies hated Germany, hated Germans, wanted to destroy them all. But what if that had been another lie? What if the enemy had only ever been the men who started the war, not the people who suffered through it? The thought was both liberating and terrifying. The antagonist, not everyone at Camp Ruston was ready to accept American kindness, and the woman who would challenge Elena most fiercely was about to make her presence known. Katerina Becker was 38 years old, tall and severe, with dark hair pulled back so tightly it stretched the skin of her forehead. She had sharp features that might have been beautiful once, but were now hardened by ideology and loss. She was the wife of an SS administrator, a true believer in the Reich, and she wore her fading Wehrmacht uniform like armor against the corruption she saw all around her. While the other women gradually accepted their donated clothes, Katerina refused. She patched her uniform carefully, mending the tears, washing it by hand each week, keeping it as close to regulation as possible. It was an act of defiance, a visible reminder that she had not surrendered, not really, not in the ways that mattered. She watched Elena with particular disapproval, watched her laugh at Jim Sullivan's jokes, watched her eat American food without visible guilt, watched her embrace the English language and the donated dresses and the comfortable routine of captivity. The confrontation came in early December as the camp began preparations for Christmas. Elena was in the barracks helping Greta fold clean laundry when Katharina approached. Her face was set in hard lines, her eyes cold. "You laugh with the enemy, Elena Hartmann," she said in German, her voice loud enough that several other women looked up from their activities. Elena straightened, folding a sheet carefully before responding. "They are not our enemies. The war is over." Katarina's laugh was bitter sharp as broken glass. "The war is never over. You think kindness erases what they did, what they represent." She stepped closer, her voice dropping but losing none of its intensity. "You disgrace the memory of those who died for the fatherland. Your brother Carl died fighting Americans, and you laugh with them, share meals with them, learn their language like some eager schoolgirl. The mention of Carl hit Elena like a physical blow. She felt the air leave her lungs, felt the familiar guilt rise up and threaten to choke her. What would Carl say if he could see you now? Katerina pressed, sensing weakness. What would he think of his sister, who has forgotten her loyalty? Lena had no answer. The question haunted her in the dark hours of the night when sleep would not come and the ghosts of the past pressed close. I am organizing the true Germans. Katerina continued, her voice taking on a recruiting tone. Those who remember what we fought for. Those who will not be corrupted by enemy propaganda disguised as charity. You can join us, Elena, or you can be labeled what you are, a traitor. She turned and walked away, leaving Elena standing there with a half-folded sheet in her hands and a hollow feeling in her chest. Over the next few days, it became clear that Katerina had been working on this division for some time. She had gathered 6 other women, all older, all harder, all clinging to the old beliefs because the alternative was too painful to contemplate. They sat together at meals, worked together when possible, spoke only German, and refused to use English even when addressed by American guards. They created a visible split in the camp. On one side, the majority who had accepted their situation and were trying to make the best of it. On the other, Katerina's group, the self-proclaimed true Germans who wore their suffering like badges of honor. Young Clara, the 19-year-old from Hamburg, found herself caught in the middle. She respected Katerina's conviction, but was drawn to Elena's pragmatism. One evening, she approached Elena's bunk, her face troubled. Frau Hartmann, she said quietly, Frau Becker says I must refuse to work in the kitchen. That helping the Americans makes me a collaborator. But I have nothing. My family has nothing. The small wages I earn, I send home. Is it wrong to accept their kindness? Elena looked at this girl, barely more than a child, and saw herself reflected back. The confusion, the guilt, the desperate need for someone to tell her what was right. Clara, Elena said gently, accepting kindness is not betrayal. It is survival. And perhaps it is the beginning of something new, something better than what came before. Frau Becker says there can be no peace with the enemy. Elena took Clara's hand, held it between both of hers. But what if they are not the enemy? What if we were wrong about everything? The question hung in the air between them, dangerous and liberating in equal measure. Christmas approaches. December brought cooler weather and preparations for Christmas. The Americans seemed determined to celebrate, decorating the camp with pine trees, strung with electric lights, hanging paper chains made by local school children, playing carols on the radio constantly. The women watched these preparations with mixed feelings. For some, it was a painful reminder of Christmases past, of families gathered around tables groaning with food, of children opening presents of a world that no longer existed. For others, it was a curiosity, a glimpse into how the enemy celebrated their holy days. Katerina watched with barely concealed contempt. They try to buy our souls with decorations and songs, she said loudly in the mess hall one morning, as if we are children who can be distracted by shiny things. But even she could not completely resist the pull of the season. Elena saw her sometimes when she thought no one was watching, staring at the Christmas tree in the recreation hall with an expression that was almost wistful. Jim approached Elena one afternoon with a request. Miss Hartmann, he said, would you help me translate some Christmas carols into German? I thought the ladies might like to sing in their own language too. Elena hesitated. She could feel Katharina's eyes on her from across the room, could sense the judgment, the accusation of collaboration. But she thought of Clara, of the younger women who deserved to have something beautiful in their lives, who deserved to remember that there was more to the world than war and loss and guilt. Yes, she said, I will help. They worked together over several afternoons, Jim reading out the English lyrics, Elena translating them into German, both of them laughing at the awkwardness of trying to make words fit melodies they were not designed for. Silent Night was the easiest. Stille Nacht. It had been written in German originally before being translated into English. The other women gathered around to listen as Jim and Elena practiced it together, his deep voice blending with her softer one, creating something that was neither fully American nor fully German, but somehow both. Katerina sat in the corner with her loyal followers refusing to participate, her face set in hard lines of disapproval. Tomorrow we show them, Elena heard her whisper to her group on Christmas Eve. Tomorrow we make our stand. True Germans do not celebrate with the enemy. Elena lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the breathing of the other women around her. She thought about Karl, about what he would say if he could see her now. Would he call her traitor? Would he understand that she was trying to survive the only way she knew how? Would he forgive her for being alive when he was dead? She thought about her mother in Berlin, shivering in a basement, eating bread bought with a wedding ring. She thought about Jim Sullivan and his patient kindness, his refusal to hate even when hate would have been easier. She thought about Katharina Becker and her rigid adherence to beliefs that had already destroyed everything she claimed to love. And she thought about tomorrow, Christmas Day, when the Americans would serve a feast and distribute gifts and force everyone in the camp to confront the uncomfortable truth that the enemy was showing them more humanity than their own nation ever had. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The camp settled into the quiet rhythms of sleep. But Elena remained awake, caught between two worlds belonging fully to neither, wondering what the morning would bring and whether she would have the courage to face it. Tomorrow would force a choice. Tomorrow would reveal who had truly surrendered and who was still fighting a war that had already been lost. Tomorrow, Elena sensed, would change everything. Act 4, Christmas Day. Christmas morning arrived cold and clear, the Louisiana sky a brilliant blue that hurt to look at. The mess hall had been transformed overnight. Pine boughs draped the walls, filling the air with their sharp, clean scent. Paper chains in red and green hung from the ceiling, each link carefully crafted by children in the local schools. A Christmas tree stood in the corner decorated with strings of popcorn and cranberries and small ornaments that caught the morning light. The tables groaned under the weight of food, turkey golden brown and glistening with butter, ham studded with cloves glazed with honey and brown sugar, sweet potatoes covered with marshmallows that had been melted to a perfect golden brown, green bean casserole, cornbread, rolls so soft they seemed to melt when you touched them, and pies. So many pies, apple and pecan and pumpkin, each one a work of art. The women filed in slowly, uncertainly, not quite believing what they were seeing. Even those who had been at the camp for weeks, who had grown accustomed to American abundance, seemed shocked by the sheer excess of it all. Elena stood in the doorway, taking it in. The decorations, the food, the American soldiers in their dress uniforms smiling and wishing the women Merry Christmas in careful German. It was overwhelming, beautiful, and somehow deeply wrong. Then came the gifts. Volunteers from town carried in boxes filled with small packages wrapped in newspaper and tied with string. Each package had a handwritten card attached. From a friend in Ruston, Merry Christmas. May you find peace. The packages were distributed one by one, an American officer calling out names, women coming forward to claim their gifts, with expressions that ranged from wonder to suspicion to barely contained emotion. When Elena received hers, she felt the weight of it in her hands, felt the careful wrapping, the thought that had gone into it. She carried it back to her table and set it down, afraid to open it, afraid of what it might mean to accept this kindness. Around her, other women were opening their packages. Gasps of surprise, tears, laughter that sounded almost hysterical. Inside the newspaper wrapping were small treasures: knitted mittens, bars of good soap, small bottles of perfume, handkerchiefs with embroidered edges. Simple things, but to women who had nothing, they were precious beyond measure. Elena carefully unwrapped her package. Inside was a pair of cream-colored mittens, hand-knitted with a skill that spoke of years of practice, a bar of lavender soap, and a small glass bottle of perfume that, when she opened it, smelled of roses. She held these gifts in her hands and felt something break inside her chest. Then Katerina stood up. The sound of her chair scraping against the floor cut through the happy murmur of the room. Every head turned. Katerina stood rigid, her face pale with fury, holding her unopened package in one hand like it was contaminated. "This is bribery," she said in German, her voice loud and clear and shaking with emotion. "Psychological warfare. They try to buy our souls with soap and mittens." The room fell silent. Even the American soldiers, who did not speak German, could sense the shift in atmosphere, the sudden tension crackling through the air. "While our families starve in ruins we created," Katerina continued, her voice rising, "we sit here eating turkey, like guests, not prisoners. We accept gifts from strangers while our mothers trade wedding rings for bread. Have you all forgotten who you are? Have you forgotten what we fought for? She held the package high above her head. I refuse this. I refuse to be corrupted. And then she threw it. The package hit the floor hard. The glass perfume bottle inside shattered. The smell of roses filled the air, sweet and cloying and suddenly sickening. Her 6 followers sat frozen, uncertain. One reached for her own package as if to throw it as well, but her hands trembled and she could not quite complete the gesture. Young Clara, sitting at Elena's table, clutched her package to her chest, her face torn between respect for Katerina's conviction and desperate desire to keep what she had been given. Jim Sullivan stepped forward from where he had been standing with the other soldiers. His movement was calm, unhurried, but there was something in his face that commanded attention. He walked to where Katerina stood bent down and carefully picked up the broken perfume bottle, the newspaper wrapping the mittens that had spilled out. "Ma'am," he said quietly, but his voice carried through the silent room. "Nobody's forcing you to accept anything. But these gifts aren't from the U.S. government. They're from regular folks in town, church ladies, shopkeepers, families who heard there were women here who lost everything. They just wanted to help. That's all." He stood holding the broken pieces and turned to address the entire room. "You're free to refuse. You're free to accept. That's what freedom means. Choice." Katerina's face flushed red. "You speak of freedom while we are imprisoned. You speak of choice while we have none. This is hypocrisy. This is the enemy pretending to be savior." Elena found herself standing before she had consciously decided to move. Her legs carried her forward until she was facing Katerina across the space where the broken perfume bottle had fallen. "Katerina," she said in German, her voice shaking but clear, "I understand your anger. I feel it too. But these people are not our enemies." Katerina's eyes narrowed. "Then what are they, Elena? What do you call the nation that bombed our cities, that killed our sons and brothers?" "The real enemy," Elena said, and the words felt like they were being torn from somewhere deep inside her, "was the lie we were sold. That hate makes us strong. That kindness is weakness. That some lives matter more than others. And what would your brother Carl say?" Katharina's voice was sharp, cruel, designed to wound. "The brother who died fighting Americans. Would he call you wise? Or would he call you traitor?" The question hit Elena like a fist to the stomach. For a moment she could not breathe, could not think, could only see Carl's face, young and grinning, and so impossibly alive in her memory. Then Greta Wolf stood her chair, scraping back. "My brother is dead too," she said quietly. "My husband, my son, all dead, all killed in this war. And you know what I think they would say?" She walked over to stand beside Elena, her weathered face calm. "I think they would say, live. I think they would say, survive. I think they would say, do not let hate destroy what is left of you the way it destroyed us." Katerina looked around the room, seeking support, seeking validation. 3 of her 6 followers would not meet her eyes. One of them, an older woman named Ilsa, slowly opened her package and took out the mittens inside, holding them like they were made of spun gold. "Traitors," Katerina hissed. "All of you!" She turned and walked out of the mess hall, her footsteps echoing in the silence. 2 women followed her, loyal to the end. But 4 remained, and young Clara hugged her package closer, a single tear rolling down her cheek. The Christmas meal continued, but the joy had been dampened. Elena ate mechanically, tasting nothing, the confrontation playing over and over in her mind. Katerina's question haunted her. What would Carl say? She did not know. She would never know. And that uncertainty was almost worse than any answer could have been. The revelation. 3 days later, Elena found Jim sitting alone in the small garden behind the administrative building. December had turned cold, but the sun was out, warming the air just enough to make it pleasant to be outside. He was smoking a cigarette, staring at nothing, lost in thought. "Private Sullivan," Elena said softly, not wanting to startle him. He looked up and smiled, but it did not quite reach his eyes. "Miss Hartman, please sit." Elena sat on the bench beside him, leaving a respectable distance between them. "Thank you," she said, "for what you said to Katerina, for understanding." Jim took a long drag on his cigarette, exhaled slowly. "She's not wrong to be angry," he said. "I'd be angry too in her place." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Elena asked the question that had been building inside her for weeks. "Why? Why do you treat us this way? We are enemy. We worked for Wehrmacht. We are German. Why do you give us food and clothes and kindness? Why do you see us as people? Jim was quiet for so long. Elena thought he might not answer. He finished his cigarette, ground it out carefully beneath his boot. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, heavier. Can I show you something? He pulled a photograph from his wallet. It was creased and worn from being carried, the edges soft. A family portrait, a farmhouse in the background, a woman in a floral dress, a man in overalls, a teenage girl, and two young men, one with red hair and freckles, one darker, both grinning at the camera. That's my family, Jim said. Mama, Daddy, my sister Emma. That's me on the left. He pointed to the other young man. And that's my baby brother, David. Elena looked at the photograph, at the happiness captured there, at the world that had existed before war touched it. Your family is beautiful, she said. You must miss them very much. Every day, Jim said. His voice caught slightly. This photo is 2 years old. David died in March 1945. Elena felt her blood turn to ice water. I am so sorry. We're near Berlin. The words hung in the air between them. Near Berlin, where Elena had been, where she had sat in windowless bunkers, typing orders, decoding messages, managing the logistics that sent men to their deaths. March 1945, Elena whispered. I was in Berlin then, working in communications bunker. My work could have, Jim interrupted gently. Miss Hartman, look at me. She forced herself to meet his eyes. They were red-rimmed but clear. When they told me I'd be working with German prisoners, I was angry, he said. I thought I'd hate you all. Thought it would be easy to see you as the enemy. He looked back at the photograph. But then I saw you ladies get off that train. Scared, starving, broken. And I thought David wouldn't want me to hate. He was the kindest person I knew. Couldn't stand to see anything suffer. Jim's voice grew stronger. You didn't kill my brother, Elena. The war did. The hate did. The machine that ground up boys from Georgia and girls from Berlin and made corpses of them all. That's what killed David. He looked at her directly, his gaze steady. If I hate you, then David died for nothing. But if I can show you kindness despite my loss, then maybe, just maybe, that's how we stop the machine. Elena's vision blurred with tears. She pressed her hands over her mouth, trying to hold back the sobs that wanted to tear out of her chest. Guilt and grief and gratitude all collided inside her until she could not tell where one emotion ended and another began. How can you, she managed to choke out. After what you lost, how can you be kind to me? Jim put the photograph back in his wallet with careful precision. Because hate is easy, Miss Hartman. Kindness is hard. And the hard thing is usually the right thing. That night, Elena wrote in her diary with shaking hands. Jim Sullivan lost his brother. Perhaps to orders I transmitted. Perhaps because of work I did. And yet he gives me kindness. He chooses grace over vengeance. He shows me that humans can be better than their worst moments. I must become worthy of this grace. I must learn to be this kind of human. Breaking points. February brought the first hints of spring to Louisiana. Trees began to bud. Flowers appeared in unexpected places, pushing up through the earth with stubborn determination. The air grew warmer, softer, carrying the scent of new growth and impossible possibility. Elena had gained back 15 pounds. Her face had filled out, her cheeks pink with health. Her hair, which had been brittle and dull, now shone in the sunlight. She looked, Jim told her with characteristic bluntness, like a completely different person from the terrified skeletal woman who had arrived 5 months earlier. But it was not just her body that had changed. Something deeper had shifted, something fundamental, in how she saw the world and her place in it. The moment of recognition came on a warm afternoon in late February. Elena was working in the administrative office filing paperwork when a document slipped from her hands and fluttered to the floor. She bent to retrieve it, and as she straightened, she caught her reflection in the window glass. She stopped, stared. The woman looking back was healthy, clean, dressed in a simple cotton dress with a cardigan. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun. Her face was calm, peaceful almost. She looked like someone who belonged here, in this place, in this moment. She looked American. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She had become the thing she was supposed to hate. She had absorbed the enemy's values, adopted their way of seeing the world, internalized their belief in individual dignity and democratic ideals. The Americans had not broken her. They had rebuilt her. And the most terrifying part was that she did not want to go back. She did not want to return to the ruins of Germany, to the hunger and the cold, and the desperate struggle for survival. She did not want to go back to a world where questioning authority meant death and individual worth was measured only by usefulness to the state. That evening, she found Greta sitting by the stove in the barracks mending a shirt. "I do not want to go home," Elena whispered, sitting down beside her. "God forgive me, but I do not want to go back." Greta looked at her, and in her eyes, Elena saw the reflection of her own shame, her own complicated grief. "Neither do I," Greta said quietly. "God forgive me, but neither do I." They sat in silence, two women who had lost everything and found something unexpected in the ruins. Not happiness, not exactly, but something like peace, something like hope. The enemy had shown them what their own nation never had, that they mattered, that they were worth saving, that their lives had value beyond their service to a collective cause. The next day, Katerina Becker received a letter. Elena was in the barracks when she heard the sound, a low animal keen that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the earth. She ran outside and found Katerina behind the building, collapsed on the ground, a crumpled piece of paper in her hand, her body shaking with sobs so violent they seemed to tear her apart. Elena knelt beside her, not touching, just present. It took a long time for Katerina to speak. When she did, her voice was broken raw. "My husband," she managed, "executed by Soviets. War crimes. My son, 14 years old, sent to labor camp. They do not know where, but my home, destroyed everything. Everyone, gone." She looked up at Elena with eyes that were red and wild and lost. "I believe," she said, "I believe so completely, that we were right, that we were building something glorious, that our sacrifices meant something." Her voice cracked. "But my husband was not executed for building glory. He was executed for ordering deaths, for signing warrants, for crimes I did not want to see, and my son pays for it. My son pays for my blindness." Elena sat down beside her in the dirt, their shoulders almost touching. "We all believe the lie, Katerina. We are all guilty. We are all victims. Both things are true." "How do you live with it?" Katerina asked. "The guilt and the gratitude fighting inside you." "I remember that I am human," Elena said. "And humans can change. We can choose differently now." The next day, Katerina attended an English class for the first time. She still kept her Wehrmacht uniform folded carefully in her footlocker, but she wore a donated dress. She was not ready to let go completely, but she was trying. She approached Elena that evening, her face stiff with the effort of humility. "I am sorry," she said, "for what I said about your brother, for calling you traitor. I was afraid. Afraid that if you were right, then everything I suffered was for nothing." Elena took her hand. "It was not for nothing. It brought us here, it taught us, it changed us." New Life April brought warmth and the announcement that repatriation would begin soon. The war had been over for nearly a year. Germany was stabilizing slowly under Allied occupation. It was time for the prisoners to go home. But before that news came, there was another revelation. Elena had missed her monthly cycle. She had noticed but attributed it to stress, to the dramatic weight changes her body had undergone. But when the nausea started, when food she had eaten without problem suddenly made her stomach rebel, she went to Captain Morrison. The test confirmed what she had begun to suspect. "You're pregnant," the doctor said gently. "About 8 weeks." Elena sat on the examination table, one hand instinctively moving to her still flat stomach. The father was a German soldier she had known briefly before her capture. He was either dead or lost in the chaos of the Soviet zone. She would never see him again. "Are you all right?" Captain Morrison asked. Elena looked up, and to her surprise, she was smiling. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I think I am. A child, new life, born from the ashes of the old world. A baby who would never know the Germany Elena had known, who would grow up in whatever came next." She told Jim the next day, walking with him in the garden where he had shown her his brother's photograph. "I will have a baby," she said simply. Jim stopped walking. "And the father gone. Dead or missing. I am alone." Jim's face softened. "Miss Hartman, you ain't alone. You got us. We'll make sure you and that baby are taken care of." The other women rallied around her. Even Katerina contributed, knitting small garments with fierce concentration. The baby became a symbol of hope for all of them, proof that life continued, that the future was not just ashes and ruins, But with hope came the knowledge that she had to go home. Not for herself, but for this child. To build a better world than the one that had destroyed everything else. Farewell. The announcement came in mid-April. Repatriation would begin in early May. Elena had 3 weeks to prepare. Jim found her in the garden again, standing among the roses she had helped plant, one hand on her belly, where the baby grew. "How are you feeling about going home?" he asked. Elena was quiet for a long moment. "Afraid," she said finally. "Afraid of everything. Seeing my mother, seeing the ruins, going back to hunger and cold, going back to being who I was before." Jim pulled up a wooden crate and sat down, gesturing for her to join him. "You ain't the same person who arrived here last October," he said. "You've changed. That's not a bad thing. That's growth." "But my people," Elena said, her voice breaking. "My mother, they have suffered so much. And I have been here safe, fed, comfortable. How can I face them? You survived," Jim said firmly. "That ain't something to feel guilty about. You survived and you learned and you grew. Now you can go home and help rebuild. Not just the buildings and the roads, but the ideas, the values, the way people think about each other." 2 days later, a telegram arrived. Red Cross. Official. Captain Morrison brought it to Elena personally, her face somber. Elena's hands shook as she opened it. Ernst Hartmann, prisoner number 4719, deceased February 1946, Soviet labor camp Sachsenhausen. Death from malnutrition and typhus. Remains unrecovered. February, 2 months ago. While she had been eating turkey at Christmas. While she had been laughing at Jim's jokes. While she had been safe. Her father had died alone in a Soviet camp. The grief was crushing, but it was Greta who helped her process it, who reminded her that surviving did not dishonor the dead. "Your father would not want you to suffer for being alive," she said. "He would want you to live, to raise that baby, to build something better." On her last day at Camp Ruston, Jim gave Elena a package. Inside was a small American flag carefully folded, a collection of photographs from her time at the camp documenting her transformation, and a letter. She read it that night, sitting on her bunk, tears streaming down her face. "Dear Miss Hartman, you have been one of the best people I have known. You have shown me that forgiveness is not weakness, it is the strongest thing a human can do. Do not forget what you learned here, that people are people no matter where they are from, that kindness is stronger than hate, that you matter not because of what you can do for your country, but just because you are you, about that baby you are carrying. That child is going to have one hell of a mother, strong, brave, kind. Raise that child to remember that humans can choose differently, that we can break cycles of hate. You are not my enemy. You never were. You are just someone who got caught up in something terrible and came out the other side. That makes you pretty strong in my book. Your friend always." James Sullivan. Epilogue. Full circle, Elena returned to Berlin in June 1946. She found her mother alive, skeletal, living in a basement with 2 other families. The reunion was tearful, joyous, complicated. In December, she gave birth to a daughter, Sophia. Wisdom born from suffering. She taught English to neighborhood children. She wrote to Jim every Christmas, and he always wrote back. She rebuilt her life one small choice at a time, planting roses, teaching kindness, showing Germany what was possible. The years passed. Her mother died peacefully in 1955. Sophia grew up strong and determined, became a lawyer fighting for refugees and prisoners. In 1975, Jim visited Berlin with his wife and daughter, and he and Elena stood together at the Brandenburg Gate, 2 old friends who had changed each other's lives. In 1989, Elena watched the Berlin Wall fall. She was 67 years old. She thought of Jim, of Camp Ruston, of the roses they had planted together. "Everything you said was true," she wrote to him. "Kindness is stronger than hate. One act of grace can ripple through generations." And in 2015, Elena's granddaughter Rachel stood at the Camp Ruston Memorial with Jim's grandson Michael. They planted a rose bush together, completing the circle that had begun 70 years earlier, with a torn uniform and a hand that reached out not to hurt, but to help. The memorial plaque read, "Here 43 German women learned that humanity transcends conflict, that kindness defeats hate, and that every person has inherent worth. May we always remember the enemy is never the person before us, but the ideology that makes us forget their humanity." This is the story of Elena Hartman and James Sullivan, of a torn uniform and lavender soap and apple pie, of an American farm boy who lost his brother but chose grace anyway, of a German woman who learned that accepting kindness is the bravest thing you can do. Their story reminds us that even in war's darkest moments, someone can choose to be kind. And kindness is contagious. It multiplies. It transforms not just the recipient, but everyone they touch, creating cascades of humanity that can eventually change the world. One rose at a time, one kind act, one choice to be human. That is how we change the world.